Give me that space-time religion. Give me that space-time religion. Give me that space-time religion. It's good enough for me. It was good enough for old Einstein. It was good enough for old Einstein. It was good enough for old Einstein. It's good enough for me. Alright, time for otherdraftphysics.com. Debatephysics.com also. Did I say draft physics? Yeah. Pretty sure I did. So, I saw a space-time video and it's just so bad. Oh, it's got Leibniz in it and all kinds of shit. It's just so bad. So, yeah, I'm going to play it. And, it might take an episode or two to do it. Because there'll be just so many points to make about how they don't have no good evidence for any of this crap they spew. And it's all just really bad science. Really, really bad. And that PBS finances this crap. Just really sad. Alright, so anyway, so he's saying something about intuition here, and then we'll continue, blah, 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 blah. See if the volume is correct.
Progresses by breaking our intuitions.
Maybe a hair too loud, I don't know. So we'll try a little less. I don't know. Hard to tell. So we have to break our tuitions. Intuitions. For some dopey reason, we have to do that. Oh, let me turn that captioning off. Irritating. Alright, let us continue.
But we are now at a point where further progress may require us to do away with the most intuitive and seemingly fundamental concepts of all, space and time themselves.
So it doesn't even make any sense, because they already got rid of space and time themselves. So it's like, what are you talking about? Your whole space-time thing already says space isn't real, okay? It's all this relativity crap. Everything's just floating in some sort of time warp. Come on, get real.
Physics came into its modern form as a description of how objects move through space and...
So what all this stuff is, right? So they couldn't just show a car crashing into a brick wall. Oh yeah, and there's no kinetic energy. Yeah, they could show that. Oh, no, they show this wacky crap instead.
Time. They are the stage on which physics plays out. But that stage begins to fall apart on the tiniest scales and at the largest energies, and physics falls apart.
Yeah, and they just make up all this crap, this stupid accretion disk. I mean, what? What the hell? It's such bullshit. I mean, when black holes were bad enough, whatever these things are, these flying saucers. Oh, it's too ridiculous.
With it. Many believe that the only way to make physics whole again is...
Yes, it's to just kill all... No, that's not... No. Yeah, it's just to put all you people in prison. Oh, no, we can't do that. Yeah, just get you to shut the fuck up. That's what we need to do.
To break what may be our most powerful intuition yet.
So again, all this, who wants to even talk about intuitions or knee jerks or silly reflexes or book cover reading or any of that horse crap? It's about what the goddamn truth is and whether you have any real evidence to support your wacky, silly notions. Looks like a fucking werewolf.
In our minds, space and time seem pretty fundamental.
Yeah, I don't know whose mind that is. Again, I don't know. You don't think space is anything real, and you don't think time is actually you think time is a place. I mean, fuck, you've called it. You essentially said, we're going to make a fake dimension and shove it in there. You know, even though it violates all the rules of dimensions, no 90-degree angles, nothing like that. Oh, it's just so fucking...
But that primacy may not extend beyond our minds.
So all this is space-time glowy, sparkly rock thing. I don't know what the hell that is.
In many of the new theories that are pushing the edge of physics, space-time at its elementary level is not what we think it is.
So whatever we think it is, whatever we think it is. See, I, like Newton, think it's just 3 dimensions of positions, and stuff is moving at it, and the maximum speed something can move in it is that speed of force thing. You know, the forces all move that speed of light thing. So it's really the speed of force. And that's all there is. The matter's pushed around by a force that has a finite speed. Oh. Ooh. That's what I think it is. So I'm not one of you weers. Wooers.
We are going to explore the realness of space and time over a few upcoming episodes.
So it's not going to be anything about anything real. It's going to be about how, oh yeah, we've really got to believe it's all fake, phony, and fraud. And it's all just some sort of wooey. He's actually going to use the word monad in this video. He's actually going to admit that Leibniz believed in monads, and he's actually going to reference monads as if it's a possibility. Yeah, monad. Solitons. And I don't know why he didn't say soliton. I guess then he would have just been really outed as a religious kook.
We'll ask, do our minds hold a faithful representation of something real?
I mean, our minds can model things. We could model ducks. We can model frog jumping off rock. We can model almost everything. And this is just not that complicated. The universe really isn't doing anything to earn all of this wooey capacity, because frankly we can't see any of it. There's no evidence of the ESP
out there. And if not, why do we think about space and time the way we do?
Okay, the way you do. The way you do. The way we, as in us religious people. Why don't you just say us wooicists? You know, us space-timicists.
If space and time aren't fundamental, what is?
So this is like some person saying, well, if there's only one God, I mean, doesn't God get lonely and need somebody to talk to? And that's not a very viable theory when, you know, well, God must have had parents, right?
What do space and time emerge from? But today...
So that's the good one. The one they really should ask. And obviously time doesn't emerge from anything. It's just a consequence of there being a finite speed. And things don't happen instantaneously, therefore there's time. Ooh, that was a tough one.
We're taking the first step by exploring how the notion of absolute space and time...
So again, that would be a good notion, and people don't have that notion. So I don't know why he's saying this crap when for years he's been spouting that it isn't absolute in any sense. It's all relative.
In physics came about in the first place, and how that notion is beginning to fall apart.
So it's just amazing. You haven't had the notion for 100 years, and you're talking about how it fell apart? I mean, this, you know, it just doesn't make any sense at all. It fell apart in, say, 1735 or something, when you all went wooey.
We have this sense of space as an extended emptiness, a volume waiting to be filled with matter.
I don't think there's anything to do with this waiting crap, but this idea that there is a volume between things, and the things are just spitting crap at each other, and that's all that's happening. There's nothing else happening. There's spit moving the speed of light, and there's things spitting it. The spit. Yeah, that's about it. It's a little crude. Off the top of my head, frankly. I mean, I didn't use piss or poo, so that's a little better.
A regular, continuous, mappable space.
Yes, of course. Exactly as it appears in every single telescope you want to look through. That's exactly how it's going to appear. Like a bunch of stuff separated by a distance, and the light has to travel the distance at the very slow speed. There you go, all done.
In which everything that exists is embedded. Meanwhile, time is the continuous rolling of future into past through the present.
Whatever. So the future past thing are just ideas of ours, frankly. And time is just the fact that the universe is functioning, and it takes time for the function. And the rate of the function, you could almost argue it's like the rate of the blood flowing through our veins, means that there's only a certain amount of oxygen that can be pumped, and there's only a certain amount of this and a certain amount of that, and only these certain things can happen because there's this finite speed at which things can happen.
All governed by the same unstoppable clock.
So yes, then the clock is the speed of force. That's the thing that is consistent everywhere. And the perversion of that simple statement that the speed of light is always the same, you know, me and Einstein would agree. It's just that he thinks the perception of it is always the same. And no, your perception of it isn't always the same. It is always the same. So if you just happen to be traveling in the same direction as a beam of light, you will, in fact, if you can go fast enough, the light will appear to be not traversing as fast as it should. But you're not going to be able to measure any of that crap anyway, so it's not going to matter. But the fact is, the light is a constant speed. You can travel at a variable speed. The light can't.
But this idea of space and time as having an existence out there.
Yeah, so again, we're all the way back to Newton, just saying, yes, there's 3 dimensions, and this is why he made the argument. So, it's always a little curious that Newton's first argument in his book was a relativity argument. It was about spinning a bucket, and it doesn't seem terribly connected, except that it does have a bunch of charts about how water flows and rises and all of that stuff. But the simple point is that you'd have to be an insane, crazy kook to say the whole universe spun, and somehow by spinning, the universe made gravity in the bucket. Because that's how you'd have to explain it in any relativity sense. So the bucket defeats the whole nonsense anyway.
Independent of its contents, became cemented in popular intuition relatively recently, at the same time that...
I don't even understand what he's talking about. You people have gotten wackier and wackier. You got multiverses, you got all kinds of crap. You haven't cemented anything. You don't believe in anything real.
They became cemented in physics. However, humans have been arguing over the reality or the fundamentalness of the dimensions for millennia.
So he's implying that there's still some argument going on about the realness of space and time and matter and distance and all of that stuff, when there hasn't been any conversation about it, in 100 years. I mean, you just brought up all this crazy wooey quantum crap and this stupid relativity shit, and that's game over. You left the reasoning building.
We can summarize the 2 main conceptions of space-time as either relational, space as a network of positional relationships of objects.
It's just a network of positions, okay? The relationship part don't mean nothing without the speed of the force. So there's the time part. But you don't talk about the positional relationships, you just talk about the positions. Things are in positions. Things can decide to... things can be in a position to reflect energy, to emit energy, and they are, because of gravity. They're all hot, so they're all some positive amount of Kelvin in terms of their temperature, and they're excreting that to the universe. And so that's the only relationship there is, though. They're just excreting, oozing, okay, stuff moving at the speed of light. And if you're far away from something, then it takes a very long time for you to feel, okay, their effect.
Or absolute, a real entity that exists independent.
So these are 2 different things, okay? So that's incredibly bizarre. Positional relationship. So how can you have a positional relationship? So why didn't you just get rid of this word position, because position isn't too interesting, and just say a relative relationship? Because clearly the absolute space is the one Newton was defending. So yes, the space isn't a substance. It's just the capacity for things to have positions in it. It's just a place, a volume for the stuff to be in. So I could have a vacuum and I could shove some atoms into it and they would be in the vacuum and the atoms would have positions in the vacuum. That idea doesn't amaze anybody, I wouldn't think. I mean, it seems pretty clear, yes, that's what's happening.
Of objects, and rather contains the objects. The latter seems to have emerged only relatively recently.
So weird. Who's emerging recently? Who's saying anything rational and logical and connected to there being a real place called space and time is just a function? Who's saying that?
Let's start with the ancients. They certainly thought a lot about space. After all, they had maps and invented geometry. But the geometries of Euclid and Pythagoras and others didn't need the notion of space as an absolute entity.
It wasn't about what it needed. They figured out it's a three-dimensional world. They could walk forward, they could walk back, they could walk left, they could go sideways, they could jump up, and they could fall down. So they figured it out. I mean, to imply that Pythagoras only thought there was two dimensions, it's just such bullshit.
They were relational. For example, a triangle is defined by the relative lengths of its sides and its internal angles. You don't need a coordinate grid to define a triangle, which is good.
So what? And, obviously you do if you're going to make a pyramid. So, what's the point of playing games? There's lots of ways I can turn that into a ramp, or I could turn it into lots of different things that have 3 dimensions. So I could add another dimension without... And they certainly did. They certainly understood the concept of the other dimension. So again, he's just implying that everybody thought in 2D 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years. They didn't think in 2D.
Because, well, the ancient Greeks didn't have one. Sure, their maps had longitude and latitude, but they didn't have...
And I'm sure they had... the map said mountain, and it said valley. I'm sure it had some concept of, this goes way up here, and it goes way down there. I don't know when the first relief maps were drawn, but I imagine they're pretty old also.
Have our own mathematical habit of gridding up empty space into X, Y, and Z coordinates. As such...
So yes, they all weren't obsessed with this Z-ingness and this frickin' turning everything into formulatic way over simplifications.
They didn't tend to think of empty space as having its own independent existence.
Says you. I mean, there's just no reason to think they didn't look up into the sky and think those are things out there in space. Okay, and the space looks like it's empty. Okay, it's black and nothing there. They figured out all this stuff. I mean, Newton figuring out rainbows and shit. Come on. Yeah, this is just so unfair.
The idea of the coordinate grid came much, much later.
And nobody uses it. There's no reason for any person, okay, on Earth, okay, that isn't capable of navigating space to worry about making proper diagrams of navigating space. It's really not something that you need to worry about. Nobody does it. Nobody's that concerned.
Perhaps you've heard of the Cartesian coordinate system, X, Y...
Yeah, I don't know exactly why they call it Cartesian when it's basically was defined and supported and defended by Descartes.
And Z axes, each at 90 degrees to the others, and gridded up so that any point in space can be defined with 3 numbers, the values of the closest grid mark on each of the axes. This idea feels pretty intuitive to many of us, but it wasn't commonly used.
Yeah, because most people don't need to do any of this crap. They just don't need to worry about it. It's not part of their functional reality. Most things can be figured out in 2 dimensions, frankly. Most things that happen are only going to happen in the 2 dimensions. Most things are straight lines, and they're only going to be affected in one more line.
until after 1637, when the French...
You could argue, you're on a train and you're going to throw a baseball. Well, the only thing that can be affecting the baseball is gravity as a new force. And then you could start talking about wind, I suppose. So, yes, so you could add a third force. I mean, a third dimension.
French mathematician and philosopher René Descartes made it cool.
So that's his definition, made it cool. Oh, brother. They were just about, Descartes was walking such a tightrope between, basically had to live in exile because, he was another guy they wanted to burn at a stake. Oh, fuck. Alright, back.
With the coordinate system, it became possible to represent abstract numerical concepts in spatial terms. For example, by graphing an algebraic function. But it also gave us a tool for describing arbitrarily large and imaginary physical spaces, and this application would soon revolutionize all of physics. Regarding the actual nature of space, Descartes was firmly in the camp of philosophers like Plato, who didn't believe in empty space.
All right, now the fact that Descartes thought it was an ether, so what? So did a million other people. And the ether was, somehow contained this communication medium, and that's how things communicated with each other. And again, this is all in a time period where they were all questioning, even Galileo, this idea of light having a speed. So, they weren't all that far off. They still knew what was hitting what and how it was transferring a quantity of motion. Okay, so they had all that part right. They understood what momentum was.
Descartes said that space is only real as far as it defines the extensions of objects and matter. But the...
Yes, and it was just mushy talk, frankly. The extensions? Yeah, what does that even mean?
Invention of the first true mathematical coordinate system opened the door for a very different conception of space. And that new conception was almost entirely due to Isaac Newton.
Isaac. Anyway, yes, and, it's perfectly sensible, frankly. I've never imagined, and I didn't even, what did I know about Newton? But my whole life I've had this idea that, yes, there's 3 frickin' dimensions. It's just not that complicated. You have the choice, left, right, up, down, forward, back. Yeah, these are my choices. Makes perfect sense to me. And there's stuff like France is way over there, and I can't throw a rock to it because it's way too far away. What is there? There's nothing here. This isn't complicated.
He gave us a set of equations that could, apparently...
No, the equations were nothing, okay? It's the inverse square law, okay? There's not even an equation. He just talks for hours. Okay, about the fact that this is what everything's doing, this inverse square thing, okay? And it just really has to do with the fact that it's spherical and it's coming out and it's separate. Newton didn't say it this way, but I'm going to tell you it's just so simple. I mean, it's the inverse square law for a reason, because it's getting bigger this way and this way. That's why there's a square. As stuff is moving through space, it's getting further away, okay? Not only this way, but also this way. Yeah, it's moving away from each other this way and this way. So that's why. But it's very, very simple. So there was nothing complicated about the equations. The complicated part came in when you tried to, figure out what was happening to one thing when it's being affected by 5 other things. That's when it got complicated.
Completely described the motions of objects and how those motions change through the forces of their interactions. Newtonian mechanics is...
Yeah, it worked. Newtonian mechanics worked. Momentum and the idea that stuff is in real positions and stuff has to move the real space, that all worked really well.
Built on Descartes' coordinates and assume a universal clock.
So again, it's not a universal clock. The universal clock is the speed of events. And the fastest event, it happens at the fastest speed, which is the speed of light. So that's the clock. That's the fastest fuse that burns in the universe. So there's no, event happening. It has to happen by that clock first, and basically only. The fastest clock gets to be the clock.
Those mechanics proved wildly successful, revolutionary really.
So the revolutionary part was just putting it all together. They were getting closer and closer to the truth, and Newton just cleaned it all up really well.
Much so, perhaps, that many, including Newton, began to see that the foundational building blocks of the mechanics, the coordinates of space and time, as in some way physically real.
Why would anyone doubt the reality without some sort of profound information, like we're living in one of those Star Trekian fake rooms or something, and you can see the little frickin' circuit boards over there. Why are we pretending there was some reason to think it's a fake-averse? Who would invent that? Billions of years of evolution of chemistry, and then hundreds of millions of years of evolution of squirmy little feeling bits, and you're going to sit there and pretend it's not real? Fuck. I just don't know why the masses gravitate to this absolute shit as ideas and thoughts.
Newton himself insisted then that space is absolute.
Yes, and he demonstrated with arguments why he drew this conclusion. And his bucket example, the spinning bucket, was a really good example. The very fact that he had to sit there and ponder, how do I prove it to these imbeciles that the nonsense they're talking doesn't physically connect to actual reality? And he came up with a really good way of proving it, because he took all of your linear bullshit out and made it simple by just spinning something. Creating motion in a circle proves there's no rational relativity theory that explains what happens to the water.
Exists completely independently of any objects within it. The empty volume implied by the Cartesian grid is a thing in itself.
So again, that's exactly not what Newton argued, and his allies made it quite clear. They weren't saying the space is a something. They're saying it's just positions, it's just distance. It doesn't do anything else. It has no other function than providing the opportunity for things to be here and over there. But it isn't a something.
And according to Newton, time is also absolute.
Yes, time is a function. It doesn't do anything except measure how long it takes light to move a foot. And that's all that's happening. That's the clock. Take any photon in the universe, it's got the same clock in it, in the sense that it's going to move the same distance in the same amount of time. So there's your clock.
From Aristotle to Descartes, time was mostly understood as a counting of events.
Yeah, the event is light moving a foot. Again, Newton already had that concept in the sense, yes, he didn't know the speed of light, but they'd certainly already speculated about the fact that there is a speed. And giving it a speed made the math work even better.
But in Newton's view, there's a single universal clock that...
and Newton even pointed that out. He had all of these statistics from all of these different people in the past, about what they saw. And he even pointed out that the reason why Tycho's numbers are a little bit off is because he didn't account for the fact that it takes 75 minutes for the light to get here.
Keeps the same time for all observers. Time passes by itself, even in the absence of events.
So this is just even in the absence of events. Well, where did Newton do that speculation? Where did anybody even start talking about the absence of events? Nobody did that. So that isn't part of the story. Newton didn't worry about the absence of events when he's living in a universe chock full of shit. Why would he waste his time? I'll contemplate the universe without stuff in it for absolutely no good reason.
Or of any change.
Again, any change. Where did Newton think there was some place you could go where there's no change happening? Again, just bullshit. I mean, trying to make it sound like he's turning it into something when no, he thought it was an absolute nothing. And all it does is provide the opportunity for things to be a distance from each other, and that's it.
Newton also believed that there was an absolute notion of stillness, like a master.
yes, that something could have no quantity of motion, exactly. Things could have a maximum speed and things could have a minimum speed, and nothing, a zero. So you could have different amounts of quantity of motion in those 3 dimensions. But the 3 dimensions were real places in space, and you moved past them. The Earth right now is rotating around the sun. The sun is speeding through the galaxy. You know, there's a whole bunch of changing of positions. And yes, the fact that our relative positions aren't changing shouldn't fool us.
Frame of reference whose x, y, and z axes are unmoving. And if your position is fixed relative to those axes, then you are truly still. This is
right, and there was no reason to think something couldn't be without velocity. That somehow it's banged around and somehow it just ends up being quiet. I'll just stay here. Now the fact is the universe isn't constantly bombarding it, so it's going to be jiggling around in its stay here place, even at minimum.
Is contrary to the ideas of Galileo a century prior, who showed us that velocity is relative.
So that's not true either. I don't think there was any conflict in terms of saying that Galileo said there was no such thing as an absolute speed. So that show me.
The speed you measure for another traveler depends on your own speed.
Exactly, and that's the same relativity that Newton believed in. So Galilean relativity wasn't some thing that said, okay, there's no 3-dimensional space, the space is warped and bent. He didn't have any of those notions. So I think it's just really stretching to say that the relativity Newton understood and the relativity Galileo wrote about were somehow different, because I don't think there were any differences.
The laws of physics are the same in any non-accelerating or inertial frame, and so all such frames are equal. While Newton did accept the mathematical consequences of this...
So he's calling it the mathematical consequences, and he's saying he did accept as if he was, he didn't really want to. He had no problem understanding the notion of relative motion. 2 things could be moving through space at the same speed. I'm sure he could imagine cannonballs being fired at the same time and moving through space with their relative positions staying intact. I'm sure he understood that. And that's all Galileo was talking about.
Galilean relativity, he thought that the difficulty we have in defining a preferred inertial frame is a limitation of the human mind, not of the universe.
All right, so I don't know, you have to show me the quote. But I'm sure he just he just accepted the fact that you can progress through time with having change happen after you start off from the same place, that 2 things could have the same starting point, but they could end up in a different place because different things happen to them.
The success of Newtonian mechanics elevated the notion of the realness of space and time.
Yeah, for about 10 minutes. And then you frickin' kooky religious people started rubbing crystals and turning it all into bullshit. I mean, 20 years after Newton was dead, you were already doing your voodoo and your smoke signals.
In everyone's minds. But there was one prominent naysayer. Newton had a nemesis.
And again, it all came from Huygens. So Huygens was the real nemesis, in the sense that even though Newton always spoke glowingly of the work Huygens did, because he did a lot of good work, built good clocks, did a lot of good stuff. Clearly they had this huge difference on wave particle, and then another difference on kinetic energy, mv squared versus mv, quantity of motion. So, and all Leibniz did was blow Huygens' horn. He played Huygens' tune on his trumpet.
Maybe it was Newton who was the nemesis to this guy.
So that's really disgusting, in my opinion, to imply that everything about Leibniz as being a lawyer and a diplomat and a bullshitter and a shyster is pretty well established. He wanted to be called von Leibniz. He wore the longest, biggest wigs, he had them tailor-made, so he was the most pretentious, self-important piece of crud. And to pretend, that he's this poor innocent person who had his poor invention stolen is just such a pile of absolute shit. And it was so well established by the proofs. Leibniz talked to everyone. Now, Newton didn't. He only wrote to a few select people. But the truth is, Newton talked about his calculus 15 years before he published it. All right? And Leibniz, who talked to everyone, never wrote to anyone about inventing it 15 years ago. So it's just such bullshit to imply that the evidence doesn't point to Leibniz being the crook. I mean, he was caught forging papers, so come on, get real.
Okay, he shared a mutual nemetical relationship with the German mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Their most famous rivalry was over the discovery of calculus.
You're supposed to call him von Leibniz. Why aren't you calling him von Leibniz? That's what he wanted. It's really annoying. I mean, to resurrect Leibniz into anything other than a crazy religious kook is just such bullshit. Yes, he did one or two rational things, maybe, said a few things eloquently and nicely, but it was all bullshit. It was all somebody else's bullshit. He didn't invent this stuff. He just exploited the stuff.
Which they figured out independently, with Leibniz probably getting to it first.
Oh, it's just amazing that he said Leibniz getting to it first, when every shred of evidence indicates Newton had it long before Leibniz even could possibly have had a notion of it. Disgusting that he would say this shit.
Newton, however, accused him of plagiarism.
Though that's not true, okay? What happened was Fadio, the guy who invented Lesage gravity, isn't it just so funny, who Newton liked, okay, and Fadio loved Newton, and it was Fadio who first made public references to Leibniz being a scoundrel and a crook.
And being by far the most powerful scientist of his day, secured the credit for himself. But another point of contention
is just disgusting. So look, yeah, the fact is that Newton didn't even think of this as a controversy, because he would say, who the fuck could think this other guy did any of this shit? Okay, come on, get real. I mean, it's Newton all over the place. The whole idea of it, the whole purpose of it, the whole use of it, the whole functional diagramming of the universe with it. What did Leibniz do with it? He didn't do anything with his calculus. Newton told you everything about every stupid moving thing in the whole fucking solar system. Did Leibniz do any of that? No. Leibniz thought all stuff moved for magical reasons, because it was full of spirit energy. Living force.
Between these two was on the nature of space and time. Leibniz did not accept Newton's assertion that these dimensions were in some sense real and independent of anything in them.
So it's just, yes, he was so God obsessed, okay? He had to make it all into some sort of godly functions, and it doesn't have anything to do with being a physical, material, mechanical universe, because everything that happens because God wants it that way. God wanted the plague. He wanted millions of people to suffer horribly and die. That's what God wants. Well, hundreds of thousands, whatever the right number is. It's a perfect world. This is the guy famous for saying it's the best of all possible worlds. Because it's God's invention and God couldn't possibly make even one tiny mistake.
Instead, he thought that both space and time were relational. What does that even mean? Well, it means that objects exist, but they don't live in a 3 or any other dimensional space.
So what does that even mean? It's just so stupid. It's just so not evidenced by any evidence, but wishful thinking or some other kind of crap, just as there was zero evidence for any kind of squared kinetic energy stuff, where you square the velocity and find a whole bunch of extra energy. So light things going fast have all kinds of superpowers, and heavy things going slow can't do nothing. They're just so weak and pussy. Hummingbirds, full of energy. Elephants, oh yeah, they got no energy at all.
Rather, what we think of spatial separation is a quality of the objects themselves, or rather of the connection between them.
So, I don't even know. So, is that a quote from Leibniz? I don't think so. It wasn't in quotes. But whatever. He believed in things called solitons and monads, and it is the most incomprehensible pile of gibberish. Go read some Leibniz and just watch your brain curdle.
Exactly why Leibniz thought this and rejected Newton is a whole thing that we don't have time to get into.
Oh, okay, so we won't say the words. It's because Leibniz was a frickin' goddamn Muslim. He was a fanatic, loony, religious kook who, again, tried. He really did try to get Descartes and Newton put in jail, for heresy. He was that crazy.
Right now. Instead, let me try to give you a sense of what it could mean for space to be encoded in the objects or in their...
Yeah, what it could mean for space. The space is encoded in the objects somehow, and so the objects are all really just in the same space, but they have a special encoding that explains that, oh no, they're really out here and over here and over here, but they're really here. Yes, they're really here in the same space, but they're also really right out here in this other space because they have a special code that says they're out there in the real space. It's fucking bullshit. Oh, I don't know how you... God. I mean, I wouldn't mind if they started stoning physicists, just because it's just so obscene that they can get away with talking so much shit. And nobody throws anything back at these fucktards. Oh. Not back. I think this is where it starts to get wacky.
Relationships, rather than existing independently of those objects. Let's start by imagining only one dimension of space, represented as a line. This is a Newtonian space, where every point represents an absolute position in a 1D universe. We can put some particles in this universe.
So there's just no point in this, right? So he's going to put 3-dimensional style particles in a 1-dimensional universe, which is, what the fuck? How did you do that? This doesn't make any sense. So why do this? Why pretend there's such a thing as a 1-dimensional universe? There's 1-dimensional objects. I mean, objects that only have, 1 dimension that they function in. And in terms of, well, I guess they're all 2 dimensions. Regardless, there's things that are flat, like a galaxy. Okay.
The position in space is defined, well, by its position in space, whatever grid mark it's next to, if we add a coordinate system.
Right, so just he's pretending to put things that are bigger than the universe in the universe, which doesn't make any sense, and then saying they only have this one grid line, and yet they already have 2 dimensions. So what's the point? What is this? How could this be illustrating anything rational? I mean, it's just such crap.
The particles might have intrinsic or internal properties, say mass, electric charge, etc.
Oh yeah, spin and hydromoment and double muon, puon moments, all kinds of different moments and other kinds of spin dioxyricities and other silly shit they make up. Gluonosity.
But their position isn't a quantity that's intrinsic to the particle.
So again, yes, obviously. Oh, except it's intrinsic in the sense that there's absolute distances that actually exist between objects. So outside of that, it's not something the moon isn't making space. Yeah, that's true. And the Earth isn't making space.
In Leibniz's view, there is no space, so we get rid of the line.
Right, and so it doesn't make any sense at all to say there is no space at all. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. So Leibniz's theory is that the reality was all us projecting it, and that God was giving us those powers to project. It's a frickin' religion.
The particles still exist, but they aren't anywhere. They're sort of just bundles of properties with no size or location.
So whatever all that means, there's just so the place it exists in, it's a number in the matrix. It's not. It's that's where we are here. So that's how silly this is all going to get, is that the things themselves are a hologram on the whatever event horizon of a black hole. I mean, it's just our accretion disk, whatever. This is just such bullshit.
Space doesn't exist, so maybe we should place these particles on top of each other. But then again, if location is meaningless, we might as well separate them.
So what does that even mean? Location is meaningless. It's supposed to be a fucking property within the things that are location. Some sort of data about position. They had positions before, now they don't have any position. So when there was a line and there was one dimension, they had something called a position property. Now they don't have no position property.
So we can actually see them. Let's add a new property to each particle that we'll call...
What is all this? I'm again giving it all of these kinds of features, defining basically its reality in a three-dimensional space. They're just using these numbers to represent a reality that actually exists, and they're creating this fake place that somehow stores information about that reality. As if there's some place somewhere, that has your brain configuration stored in it.
X. X is what we call a degree of freedom. Something of...
Oh, whatever. Just nonsense. No silly terminology. Freedom is a bullshit word. All there are levels. There's just degrees of confinement. There's no such thing as degrees of freedom. There's just degrees of confinement.
About the particle that contains...
And the universe is full of confining things. The speed of force, for example. Confinements. The fact that matter has to be pushed by momentum.
Take on different values and it can change. Other degrees of freedom could be the energy, the phase, the spin, and...
Maybe all this made up crap, the energy, the phase, like it has a phase, it's just made up shit.
So on. X behaves in a particular way. For example, it can change freely. And if it's changing, then it keeps...
Change freely to what? What is it changing from platypus to whatever? Mountain dog? What the hell are you talking about? Mountain dog.
It's changing at the same rate and in the same direction. Now, these particles have no idea about each other's existence, except in special circumstances.
Whatever that even means. So 1 minute ago they had that property that would somehow relate them to a three-dimensional universe if they could find one to exist in, and now they don't have any such properties, and everything about what's going to happen to the thing and everything about how it's going to interact is dependent on it having that information, being a certain distance from the moon. So again, we're all the way back to silly ideas that the moon doesn't exist when we're not looking at it. That's the nonsense of this crap.
For example, if two particles have values of this x thing that are close enough to each other, then those x values influence each other, changing
So this is like some sort of quantum entanglement crap. Oh, do they do it instantaneously?
the rate at which the dials turn. Maybe they want to try to be more similar, or maybe they try to be more different. If we were
So obviously this has nothing to do with Leibniz. I mean, Leibniz didn't do any of this. It was all God controlling the dials in the creation of his perfect world.
to represent these x values with position on a number line, an x-axis, then the behavior of the particles looks just like particles moving around in space and attracting or repelling each other, only when they're close together.
So whatever that means again. So it's not entanglement, because obviously entanglement doesn't care how close you are. I mean, it's just too ridiculous.
We can't tell the difference between particles moving in space versus space-like behavior emerging from a degree of freedom within the particles.
Oh, so yeah, it does. What? I just can't do this. It's just so pathetic. How they even invent this? They hired somebody to do these animations of this absolute nonsense. What could this possibly have to do with anything real?
This thought experiment isn't explicitly...
It's complete nonsense. I don't know. I can't even understand. I don't even know how this thought experiment has anything to do with thinking. It's so abstract and disconnected from anything real.
What Leibniz described?
It's like they're trying to invent fake chaos or something, some sort of fake random silliness, and saying, look how good we are at creating random silliness.
Nor is it how things should really be to explain a universe like our own. For one thing, we need 3 spatial dimensions, not 1. X, Y, and Z would all have to be close to each other for particles to...
So again, what is this? This is just so idiotic. So somehow it's encoded in the particle, the fact that there's a whole universe. And so each particle has an image of the whole universe. It has encoded information about the whole universe. Oh, fuck.
Interact. Also, Leibniz thought that position was encoded in the relationships between particles, not in the objects themselves.
So this is not, again, it's not Leibniz. Leibniz didn't do any of this. I've read a lot of Leibniz. Leibniz didn't do any of this, but the magical word is coming up.
He gave his elementary particles names. Monads.
There you go. And solitons. Soliton. And he doesn't mean soliton, like sun-aton. He means soul, like ghost.
Which, among other things, had rudimentary consciousness. And
Yeah, rudimentary consciousness. I mean, isn't this a huge giant giveaway? I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with any kind of rational understanding of the biology, the geology, it has no relation to any other natural science.
and that space emerged from their first-person perspectives of each other.
Yeah, whatever. So yes, I see you. So now you exist. But later I'm not going to see you and you're going to disappear.
But we don't need those extra qualities. The idea of particles with interacting internal degrees of freedom illustrates how space can emerge from the relationships between elements that are themselves not in space.
Alright, so this is just so, it just breaks all kinds of notions of elemental universe and a universe that, you know, like evolution, you start with something simple and the simple thing gets more and more complicated. In terms of just relationships and density, the amount of it makes it possible for you to make something out of the single pixels on a screen. But the pixels themselves are really simple.
So that's Leibniz on space. He disagreed with Newton on time in a similar way, believing it to be a measure of the change intrinsic to each element rather than a cosmic clock that kept the universe in sync.
Yes, but yes, you can't make any sense of it because he didn't have any evidence of anything breaking the rigid rules of time. So again, what's the point of it? It doesn't relate to anything real. It just relates to a notion that God can make anything happen at any moment. That it's a God-averse. It wasn't anything to do with it being physics. It's Godics.
Of course, Newton was the undisputed boss of science back then.
Oh, so this boss of science nonsense, and it was well fucking earned, you douchebag. You fucking douche. I mean, he earned it.
And so his preference for absolute space and time won over the physicists.
Oh, yeah, no, his arguments won over the physicists, and the silly arguments of Leibniz failed. That's the simple truth. They were really stupid arguments, backed up with no evidence. So, of course, they failed. Again, even on the kinetic energy thing, they said this crap, and people just made the argument. Well, then, how do you explain a balance, a lever? The rules of a lever are saying different quantities equal each other. So which one's telling the truth? Your imagined world or this proven thing? This thing for thousands of years has reliably measured weights and balanced things, and you're going to say all of those numbers were lies?
And ultimately found its way into the popular imagination. But who was really right? Are objects in space and moving through time, or are space and time somehow in objects and their connections? Are the dimensions absolute or relational?
So more just babble. Was Newton correct in making a rational argument defending? And is there anything you can show that demonstrates Newton's wrong about this idea that there's 3 dimensions of space and things are in positions in those 3 dimensions in space and they have to communicate with a force moving the speed of force?
Next big development seemed to support Newton. Over the 19th century, our understanding of the phenomena of electricity and magnetism.
So this is the big joke, because obviously they had already accepted the wave theory and they'd already jumped on board to kinetic energy, which is just gives light things preposterous amounts of energy and gives heavy things, it completely underestimates their capacity to cause change in the universe. Wrecking balls are silly, and speeding protons are the way to go.
Magnetism converged, revealing the existence of something called the electromagnetic field.
So again, none of this was revealed, none of this is real, none of this has anything to do with reality. The fields are not just magical fields, it's made out of real stuff at real frequencies, causing real effects based on tipping point type arguments and resonant frequency arguments, and none of this wooey mush about some special field that's doing it. It's a field of something. It's a field of real pieces of momentum carrying force. That's what communicates between things. That's what's causing gravity.
Field. A field is just some property that can take on a numerical
right. So that has nothing to do with Newton.
Value at all points in space. For example, temperature is a field defined in...
So we know that temperature is made out of frickin' photons that are being excreted. That the temperature is caused by real motion. That there's a whole bunch of momentum. So a whole bunch of stuff is moving, and a bunch of stuff with momentum. So temperature is just a measure of momentum.
The air around you. It's emergent from the properties of the air particles.
So again, emerging from the properties of the particles. The property of the particles is they have velocities. And the velocities and the masses add up to a quantity of motion. And the higher the quantity of motion, and you put it in a smaller and smaller space, it's going to look hot because it's going to have to excrete that heat. It's going to have to excrete that motion.
But the electromagnetic field doesn't need particles.
It's basically a bunch of particles pushing. Pushing, push-averse, pushing. Compressing the energy in the universe, the field, the frequency, compressing the frequency. Jesus.
For the first time, it seemed that a field could be a property of space itself.
Oh, so it's just so sad. So that's just ether talk. So again, now the communication of heat and radiation and energy and influence somehow is an ether moving, when they already know they proved that wasn't true. But that's what they're drawing the conclusion. And yet they don't have something as elemental as gravity in the food chain anywhere. So even though the gravity is causing things to get hot and produce real photons into the universe, they don't account for that broken energy equation where gravity is making photonic radiation out of thin air, thin space, out of bent space. And there's no explanation for how making bent space requires you to fuel it with radiation, photons. No conservation.
So surely, if space can have properties, then space must objectively exist.
Right, must be a something. Okay. So, and again, Newton believed it objectively exists as a perfect nothing of just distance, providing you an opportunity to be separated, and that's it.
And more intrinsic properties emerged with the development of quantum mechanics. For example, space was shown to have a sort of energy, even in the absence of particles.
So this is the silly part, right? Because obviously space has energy going through it all the time. There's photons traveling through. Look, you can see the little stars behind him. There's all kinds of energy in the space moving through the space. It's just so insipid.
So-called vacuum energy. However, if we really want to decide whether space and time are real, to judge between Leibniz and Newton, we need the ultimate arbiter.
Oh, brother, what you need is reasoning, and the fact is in logic. All you need is logic, right? Because the argument should have been over, because it should have occurred to somebody that yes, the heat inside of material objects, the heat inside of them is being created by the gravity, and it's constantly being fueled. And the heat's constantly radiating into the universe as actual photons. So their theory is that bent space creates motion towards the center of things, creates a bunch of jittering motion, quantity of motion, and then that quantity of motion creates a bunch of radiant heat. And yet, they say the universe is going to die a cold death when there's a constant supply of new heat being generated.
We need the greatest expert of space and time that ever lived, and that's Albert Einstein.
Oh, brother. So, I wish they wouldn't do this. I don't think Einstein would like always to be represented by this picture where he was just saying, leave me the fuck alone, okay? I'm a scientist. I'm not some sort of celebrity or show person, But I mean, you don't really think you're being a bit unfair to the dignity of the effort he made to do science by always choosing to use these less than flattering images, less than dignified, let's just say. I have a feeling if Einstein could take that picture back, he would take it back.
We've talked about Einstein's special and general theories of relativity many times before.
Einstein was just sick of everybody asking, what's it like being the smartest man in the universe? What's it like being the smartest man in the universe? He didn't like that whole attitude.
So let's just go over what the theory changed about our notions of the dimensions. With special relativity, the separation of 3D space and 1D time ended. They became 4D space-time.
Right, which is absolute nonsense. So they can't draw it, they can't really illustrate it. So it's, this is just, let's put fake clocks on the little squares. I mean, they could have put the fake little clock in the middle of the little squares. They could have, but yes, they can't in any way make the dimensions as real as the three spatial dimensions. I mean, there's just no point in calling it the same thing. The spatial dimensions are just that, spatial dimensions. You want to talk about some other kind of dimension, then use a word like function, because that's all it's going to be. It's just cheating.
Einstein showed us that our motion through space and our motion through time are linked. A clock moving relative.
So again, he showed us, he proved, he did that. No, none of that happened. So again, all they've proven is that you can break any kind of clock. So yes, the fact is that they use atomic clocks with using isotopes to decay as a way of measuring time, and you can change the decay rate of anything. So even though they say some piece of uranium has a half-life of 10,000 years or something, no, it doesn't. Okay, I mean, you pile more of it into a smaller area and it decays faster. You can control how fast it decays. That's just a fact. You can change it. So clearly velocity might also affect how fast something decays. So it's not a huge surprise that you can break that clock too. All the other clocks are easily broken. Yes, the atomic clock can also be broken.
To you, ticks slower from your perspective. And then with general relativity, we see that the presence of...
So with general relativity, we find out that it's not about the, it's really stating that being in gravity bends your clock more. So we're the ones on Earth, we're the ones with the clock that's been fucked up, because we're the ones doing a lot of motion up and down in the gravity. We're moving the higher velocity because we're bouncing in and out of the ground at a high rate, where the thing out in space, although it's going faster in a linear sense, it's not going as fast in a least sense. It's a least line. It's much smaller than ours, and so it's our clock that is retarded and too slow.
Mass and energy stretch and warp both space and time. This causes straight line trajectories that we expect on a Cartesian grid.
Right, so this is just saying the inverse square law. So they could do all of this for the sun itself. So the light coming off of the sun, he's got an image of the sun there. The light coming off the sun is also doing the inverse square law. It's exactly the same thing. And so you could, if you were silly and crazy, sit there and say the light is a bent geodesic. Okay, and all the straight line photons are really curved. In sun time, or whatever they would want to call that, whatever in radiant energy geodesics. That's all this is. The bent geodesic is just imitating, mocking, turning into a two-dimensional grid the three dimensions of this. You're moving this way, and this way. That's the inverse square law. Alright, so I guess that's halfway. I might not even bother with the second half because I don't even know if there's anything anywhere close to rational. Well, maybe I should do it just because I know there was other crap in here that pissed me off. Alright, so I will. But that crap about Leibniz was so bad. It's so dishonest. It cheats the truth so dramatically. And it's all for this purpose of creating this silly woo-averse. Of all these special functions for which there is no explanation. So they have no explanation for why electrons repel and protons and electrons attract. They have no explanation for the same function in magnets. They have no explanation for, you could almost argue, their explanations are wrong, okay, for why the sun is hot. But I mean, all these the strong force, when now you don't need a strong force, you just shove an electron in between two protons and they'll go really close to each other. I mean, it's all a bunch of invented crap. All these special super functions they've given to things that don't exist, and there's no evidence they exist. It's just so bad, and I just can't believe you're all such dupes. That none of you can recognize that there really isn't any proof that the Newtonian perspective was catastrophically flawed. I mean, the only defect they can find is the fact that Mercury has a slight wobble in its orbit, and that could be explained by just the sun having a little bit of a wobble in its center of gravity. And that's the whole thing. So all of it, they're going to turn into this woo-averse over something that superficial. And the only way Einstein could synthesize that function is to create mathematics that's so convoluted and abstract nobody bothers even doing it. You know, just to create a wobble in the sun. That's all it's doing. That's all his tensor is doing, is wobbling the gravitational source. All right, anyway, enough. It's just so bad. So, God, I just hate it on this planet. You're really all... I mean, you're despicably stupid. It's not even that it's belligerent. It's despicably, belligerently stupid. Because you could do so much better than being a gullible sap for this crap. This is as bad as, you know, reading out of the Bible and, you know, saying these stories are real. Virgin birth, and, you know, it's just as bad. And you're licking this crap up. Yuck. Yuck. You're humiliating our intelligence. We might as well not have it if we're going to be this fucking dupable.